Assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. Welcome to the weekend, my fellow assassins. I'm not sure about you, but I am really excited for this week's episode. I've been pretty much giddy all week, just so excited just to get ready to sit down and talk with you guys about this week's episode, since I believe that we have a great one. And the reason for that is because this past week, if you didn't catch last episode was pretty good. I talked about getting the lights out management port working on my Apple Xserve. And by the way, I did mention in that episode of the podcast about a potential walkthrough and a full-on guide about how the step-by-step of how to do that yourself if you happen to have an Xserve. And that guide is now live, so if you head on over to the Dark Assassins Inc. Facebook or LinkedIn page, there are links in the show notes below for that. You will see the guide linked there, so you can go ahead and click on that, read it at your leisure, or follow it and get lights out management working on your Xserve. But in addition to that, one of you fellow assassins reached out to me with a question regarding the Xserve, which I wanted to address this week, and I thought it was an excellent question. And speaking of questions, if you have a question, I usually save this for the end of the podcast, but since the subject has come up, if you have a question, feel free to reach out to me. If you have a question or a topic that you want me to talk about or address, reach out to me at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. There is a link down in the show notes below that you can click on and send me an email. But before we get into that, of course, we have to address the age-old question of what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week? So this week, you guys, regular listeners of the show, know how much I love me some Ansible and automation. And this week, I got myself knee-deep in another Ansible project. So this week, I decided to improve my backup solution. So as I've mentioned before on this podcast, the best backup solution is a 3-2-1 backup. Now, I don't have the perfect backup solution because I don't necessarily have an offsite backup, but I try to have multiple levels of redundancy just in case something fails or whatever. I have at least other backups. It's not perfect because, like I said, I don't have an offsite backup per se, but I think it's better than nothing. But anyway, now that I have working lights out management on my Xserve, I am able to completely automate the entire backup process. Now, it's not perfect because a more perfect solution would be to have something like two different NASi, I'm not sure what the word is, but a NAS, network attached storage, have two of those and have them running something like TrueNAS, let's say. And then what you can do is you can automate the backup. So say every week, it'll automatically back everything up. But the nice thing about that is it uses a file system called ZFS. And what that can do is take like snapshots, which are essentially, if, from the software development perspective, it's kind of like Git in a way. So basically, rather than copying everything to the backup server, it just copies what's changed and what's updated, like on the byte level. So for example, if I have a Word document, and I changed, a sentence in there, that change would be updated. But my PowerPoint presentation about, the same topic, I didn't touch that, and then that wouldn't be pushed to the backup rather, because nothing has changed. And this really cuts down on, the workload and the network traffic and all that stuff about the process of backing up a system. Now, because I'm obviously using a Mac, which is the Xserve, and TrueNAS ZFS, I obviously can't do that, but I don't it's not the end of the world for me because I don't necessarily have a ton of data backup. But also then again, I have a script that completely automates everything. So even if it does take a really long time, I don't have to be there to wait for it, which is really nice. So what I did was I took a bash script and basically used that as the wrapper for two separate Ansible playbooks. So the first part of the bash script is it kicks off the first Ansible playbook, which connects out to the NAS and then archives either a single folder I want or the entire NAS, or however I want, and it'll compress that down to a tar.gz file, which is essentially it's just another way to compress data down, kind of like a zip file. So compresses that and then does a checksum of it. And the point of the checksum is because I'm copying a rather large file over the network. I want to make sure that, nothing funky happened. I mean, I don't necessarily have a reason to believe that something funky would happen, but, just in case, just have a checksum of it, the original, and then, once I copy it over, I can generate another checksum, compare them, and if they're the same, then I know nothing funky happened and all my data is A-OK. So once the archive is done and the checksum is generated, I pull that checksum back to my control machine, and then I set off the IPMI command to boot up the Xserve, and then I have it wait for about 3 minutes or so for the Xserve to complete the boot up process, and then I launch the second playbook, which from my NAS will then reach out and SCP or secure copy using SSH to copy the tar file that it just generated, the archive of the NAS, to copy that over to the Xserve's internal drive, and then after it copies that massive amount of data over, which would probably take a while, the Xserve will then generate a checksum of that data, send the checksum back to my machine, gracefully shut itself down. I'll compare the checksums, and hopefully they're both the same, and my backup has been completed, and I didn't have to do a single thing aside from a command to start it all off. So I was super excited when I did a test of that and everything worked. I was kind of doing my little happy dance, so I was very, very happy about that. But with that aside, let's get into the question that the listener, one of you fellow assassins, reached out to me with. So they ask, Dark Assassin, it sounds like the Xserve is a useful tool, so why did Apple stop supporting it? Now, this is an excellent question, and it really has two different angles to it that we have to look into. The first one is, why did they stop selling it and supporting it as far as like the hardware is concerned? Like, why did they stop selling the physical Xserves and then, selling parts for it, like hard drive, caddies and rails and power supplies and, all that stuff for it? And then the second aspect of it is, why did they stop supporting it from a software perspective? Like, why did they stop giving it macOS updates, macOS server updates, all that good stuff? So I guess the really simple and boring answer, we'll start with the first question of why did they stop selling it. The really simple and boring answer is it just didn't sell well. It really didn't. But that's boring and lame. And we want to go in depth onto why didn't it sell well? What was the reason why it didn't sell well, which caused Apple to then stop selling it? So first off, if you listened to my episode I did on the operating system showdown, I kind of talked about, which operating system is the best server operating system. And if you'll recall, macOS really isn't a good server operating system. It's just not that good. Even with the server admin tools that came with the Xserve that you could, install on it, I mean, it was okay, I guess. It's essentially, in a way, kind of turned Mac OS into Windows Server, sort of. But especially when you compare it to like Linux or a hypervisor like ESXi or Proxmox or something like that, Mac OS is just not that great. Which actually, on the subject of ESXi, I didn't realize this until I kind of started looking into this, but apparently you can run ESXi 6.0 on a 2.1 and 3.1 Xserve. I didn't know that. There's links down in the show notes if you want to go check that out. But obviously, they're not officially supported by VMware, which makes ESXi. And I guess there's good reason for this because, as you'll note if you go and take a look at those like guides on how to do it, it's not exactly a smooth process. Like there's gonna be some hiccups along the way, which kind of makes sense when you're trying to install something that's not officially supported. But going back to, Mac OS as a server operating system, compared to putting Linux or ESXi on a server and selling it, that's basically what the competition would do. So that's what Dell was doing, that's what HP was doing, that's what Supermicro was doing, that's what all the major server manufacturers were doing, was putting Linux or ESXi and sometimes, Windows Server on these servers, which was a lot more friendly to the enterprise environment. And another disadvantage that the Xserve had compared to its competitors was its lights out management capabilities. So yes, it did have them, as we discussed in length last week's episode, which, again, if you haven't listened to that, highly recommend you go check that out after this one. But while it did have lights out management, like, Dell and HP do, it didn't. The Xserve does not have any kind of web portal that you can access that lights out management from. So both Dell and HP have implementations. It's iDRAC for Dell and ILO for HP. And both of those implementations have basically KVM support in their web portals. So what this means is you can log in remotely to the web portal for the machine that you're trying to remotely access. And then you can essentially get a real-time what's going on the system screen from the web portal, or on the older implementations, you could do it through like a Java app, like on your local machine. But what this essentially allows you to do is not only shut down and boot up the machine, but because you have this console access to the machine remotely, you can access things in the BIOS, you can install operating systems from here. There's just a lot more features that you could do with this, remote console to the system, even before the OS had loaded, which wasn't a thing on the Xserve. So that was another kind of drawback when comparing the Xserve to the competition. Yeah, you could, remotely turn it on and turn it off, which, as far as home labbing is concerned, that's really all you need to do because, you're always, with your servers more or less, unless you're like traveling or something. If you need to access the hardware, you can just, plug your monitor and keyboard in and you're pretty much good to go. So it's not as big of an issue, I guess you could say. But the iDRAC and ILO implementations of Dell and HP just had a lot more features, which would be more appealing when, managing, large swaths of servers in a data center and whatnot. Now, one of the appeals, I did mention this as a drawback, but depending on how you look at it, it could also be a positive too. And that's the fact that the Xserve natively ran Mac OS. So, like I mentioned, it's also one of the drawbacks because, it's Mac OS. It's not the greatest server operating system. But if you have an environment of, a bunch of Macs, it makes it easy to manage all those Macs from a Mac. So if you have a Mac server, you can essentially use that to manage all your Macs. Just like in the Windows world, like, with schools and businesses and all that good stuff, all of the Windows machines that are deployed throughout, the company or the building or the school or whatever are managed by a Windows server that can do things like manage permissions, do Active Directory, all that good stuff. Now, macOS essentially had, its own version of that you could do, but just on obviously a lot smaller scale, since those kinds of environments weren't as prevalent because macOS doesn't control nearly as big of a market share as Windows does. So what the thing with Active Directory, I mentioned that if you're not familiar with what that is, if you ever, go to for the younger crowd that had, Windows in school, if it's basically like you log into one computer, say in the computer lab, then you go over to the library to a computer you've never logged in before, but you can still log in your account's there. That's because of Active Directory. Same thing like if you work for an organization, you can log in from any computer that's tied to the organization, and as long as it's connected to the internet and can connect to that Windows server, it can pull and authenticate you through that Active Directory. So macOS has, a similar thing that was able to be run through the server admin tools and all that stuff. But again, if you don't have as many environments that are all macOS, you're kind of limiting the amount of people that you can sell to. So you're again kind of kneecapping yourself as far as like the amount of sales that you can generate. Now, another thing that the Xserve also had was it had its own RAID box. So it was called the Xserve RAID, which was essentially just a chassis that you could stick a bunch of hard drives in. I believe it took, I want to say 14 was how many it could take. So basically it takes a bunch of hard drives. It can, plug right into the Xserve, and the Xserve can manage the RAID array. Which, if you're unfamiliar with what a RAID array is, I believe we talked about this when we talked about, the whole backup solution thing. But basically what a RAID array is essentially a way to combine a bunch of different hard drives in such a way to make them appear as a singular drive. Now, you can do this a bunch of ways to have some kind of redundancy or have no redundancy and just all one big size. There's pros and cons to every, different kind of configuration of RAID. But put simply, RAID is just a way that you can take a bunch of hard drives and combine them together to make them appear as one. But again, macOS isn't exactly the best NAS operating system. So there are a bunch of better options out on the market. So you could kind of see why it didn't necessarily do as great. Now, you might be thinking that, well, first off, if you've been listening to this episode and even last episode and you're wondering what the heck is an Xserve and whatnot, I don't blame you because the Xserve was definitely not a very widely known product because it didn't sell well. But it was essentially a 1U rack-mounted server. And the reason I put emphasis on that 1U rack-mounted server aspect is because Apple makes currently a rack-mounted quote-unquote server, if you're unfamiliar. So their Mac Pro line that they launched in 2019 does have a rack-mount version, but it is an absolute chungus. It is a very big, chunky boy. It is a 5U box. Now, if you're unfamiliar with how U systems work in the data center world, put simply, the smaller the number, the less vertical space it takes up in your rack. Now, obviously, when you're making a data center, you want to cram as many computers in there as possible. So the less amount of space that the computer takes up, the more of them you can fit. So generally speaking, a rack in a data center is around 42U, or 42 rack units, and one rack unit is 1.75 inches. So if you take, 1U Xserves, you could fit 42 of those in one rack. Whereas obviously, because the Mac Pro taking 5U, that's obviously 5 times bigger. You can't fit nearly as many in there. So, that could potentially be a problem, especially if you're trying to cram as many servers in the rack as possible. So for some context, it's 5 times bigger. So the Xserve takes up 1.75 inches of vertical space, whereas the Mac Pro would take 8.75 inches of that space. So it is a big boy, but the Mac Pro, believe it or not, even though it does have a rack mount version, isn't really the main appeal of Macs in the server world today. So the Xserve is no more, but that doesn't mean that Apple is completely out of the server realm. This may come as a surprise to some of you, but the main server appeal now is actually the Mac Mini. And part of this is because of how small and cheap they are. And data centers can easily just buy them up and throw them in their data centers like it's nothing. But the shift now has come from, rather than kind of using an Xserve to be kind of like this management thing, the Mac Mini has essentially turned into a way for cloud providers to be able to deploy macOS environments in the cloud, have remote workstations for people, and essentially to be able to lease out macOS to cloud customers. Because if you've ever tried to virtualize operating systems, you'll definitely be aware that virtualizing macOS on anything that isn't a Mac really doesn't work that well. Sure, you can do it, but the amount of work that you have to put in just to get it to quote-unquote work correctly there's a lot of hacks and workarounds and things you have to account for and settings to modify, and it's a very intense and in-depth process that's definitely not for the faint of heart, which this is completely different from Windows and Linux, where you can just throw that in a VM and put it anywhere and it'll be fine. Although Windows, it'll want to have a lot of resources, a lot of CPU power and RAM and all that stuff, whereas Linux, you can have it run on potatoes, bubblegum, and spit, and it'll be maybe not completely happy, but it'll be I can work with this. But yeah, macOS is just completely different, and obviously there's not much point in selling Mac VMs to people if you have to buy Mac hardware to be able to do it, especially if you're dealing with Mac Minis. Because one thing you have to consider is Mac Minis, it's not like they're packing a ton of cores like, these big, rack-mounted servers that have dual or sometimes quad CPU configurations that have, I guess at this point, hundreds of cores and hundreds of threads that you can throw tons of VMs on. You'll be lucky if you have a Mac Mini to maybe get 2 VMs on it, but that's probably even a little generous considering the fact that you still have to run Mac OS on it, which if you're going to be running Mac OS on it anyway, you have an additional layer in between the VMs, and it's just a mess. So what's the point of doing it that way? Which is, again, kind of what's the point in running macOS in a VM if you just have to have macOS anyway to be able to run it in a VM? So it just makes kind of more sense to, have it just standalone. Now I'll have a link down below about how AWS is using Mac Minis in their data centers if you want to check it out. But if you ever are looking around on, data center and cloud providers and you see Mac OS as an option, you're probably going to be working on a Mac Mini, which is kind of cool for sure. But like I mentioned with Linux, you can absolutely throw Linux on one of these old Xserves and it'll run no problem. One of my friends actually, DOS Dude 1, if you're familiar with him, he actually has a 1,1 Xserve, which isn't even compatible with the latest versions of macOS, and he has Linux running on that thing, and from what I understand, it's doing pretty well. So yeah, that's pretty much from the hardware aspect of it, why the Xserve, why Apple stopped selling it and supporting it. Just Mac OS and the server realm just being a dedicated server, not really the market. Although the Mac Mini, being its own thing as a development environment, a remote workstation for people to have cloud access to Mac so they can develop Mac apps in the cloud, that definitely has some appeal there. Because if you're a developer, you want to make cross-platform apps, you kind of have to have a Mac to do it. And if you don't, have a Mac at your disposal, you could rent one in the cloud, spin it up, lease it when you need it to do your builds, and good to go. So that's the hardware aspect. Now let's get into the software aspect of why did they stop supporting it. So again, you could take the easy cop-out answer of it's old, which, yeah, that's part of why they stopped supporting it, since eventually everything's going to lose software support at a certain period of time. But it has a couple angles to it that go deeper than it's just old. And that is, it has its hardware limitations and incompatibility. So if we think back to when the Xserve first came out, it first came out in 2002. Now, if you aren't exactly familiar with when Apple transitioned to Intel, that was after 2002. So they were using PowerPC processors when the Xserve first came out, which means when they switched over to Intel, eventually all the macOS builds were then Intel. So once all the macOS builds were Intel, obviously there's no compatibility there between a PowerPC computer and an Intel-based operating system. So at that point, all those early Xserves all the ones before 2006 were dropped from support. Now, we're starting to see this exact thing repeat itself with the transition over to Apple Silicon. Eventually, whenever they decide to stop making an Intel version, eventually there will be zero compatibility for Intel Macs. Now, I'm not sure if the open core legacy patcher community will somehow find a hack around to get Intel Macs running with an only ARM build of macOS. We broke down some potential possibilities on how that could be done. A while back. But realistically, I don't know if I really see it happening. But that aside, that still leaves us with three models of Xserve. The 1,1 Xserve from 2006, which I mentioned isn't compatible with OpenCore Legacy Patcher, and the reason for that is another hardware limitation. So the 1,1 Xserve used 32-bit processors, which Apple stopped making a 32-bit version of macOS after macOS 10 Lion. So after that point, all versions of macOS were 64-bit only, which means a 32-bit processor cannot run a 64-bit operating system, and therefore the 1,1 Xserve was dropped from support. But the 2,1 and 3,1 Xserves are still supported through OpenCore Legacy Patcher, but are not supported through Apple. So here is where people just make the argument, oh, it's just old. Which, yeah, sure. But personally, while it does kind of come down to age, they are 14 years old, but they can also still run the latest version of macOS. And the reason for that is because of the fact that they use enterprise-level hardware. Now, enterprise-level hardware is always significantly more powerful and more performant than any consumer-grade hardware of the same generation. So if we're talking 14 years ago, the chips back then were, I don't know, what were they, like Core Duos or Core 2 Duos or Core Solos. Obviously pretty anemic chips. And then you had, the server chips that were obviously a lot more powerful. And one thing that I usually see, since, I'm in the home lab space, which if you're not in the home lab space, you might not see this as much. But one thing that we like to do is compare old enterprise hardware to the latest and greatest in the consumer hardware. And there's always a point where, like, you'll have old enterprise hardware from years back that is still, like, button heads and competing with the latest and greatest hardware. Now, obviously, those old enterprise chips, while they're able to compete with the new consumer grade chip, they're generally using a lot more cores and drawing a significantly larger amount of power to get to those similar numbers, not to mention the fact that their single core performance or single threaded performance, or essentially the performance you'll see like day to day and like opening applications and like web browsing and that thing, is always significantly worse on the old enterprise hardware. But if you're talking about like multi-threaded performance, like, compiling code and, building projects and things that need a lot of, processing power, they can kind of sort of keep up as long as you can stomach the power bill that they will ensue because of how much more power they draw. Now, another thing to keep in mind when it comes to enterprise hardware is generally data centers have a refresh cycle of about 5-ish years or so. So if you think, so essentially after 5 years or so, they'll start replacing their hardware with the newest, latest, and greatest stuff. But obviously, 5 years of this enterprise hardware still means that these systems are more than capable of performing, at the highest level. It's just, for various reasons, data centers want to upgrade, so they're at the latest and greatest, and as also for hardware reliability concerns. Obviously, as something gets older, the likelihood increases that, you'll have an issue arise with it or whatever. But there's always that saying that today's data centers, tomorrow's home lab. That's definitely true. But when we're talking about the Apple Xserve and its run in the data center, so Apple discontinued the 3.1 Xserve in January of 2011 and ended software support for the 3.1 with El Capitan, which debuted in 2015 and ran through 2016. And then 2016 was when they released macOS Sierra, and the 3.1 Xserve was not supported in that build of macOS, which, if you think about the math here, it really lines up perfectly with when the 3.1 Xserve was getting phased out of the data centers. So if it was discontinued in January 2011 and then stopped being supported with software like mid 2016-ish, that's around like the 5-year mark where data centers would be, phasing these machines out anyway, which from Apple's perspective, you could think of it like, so if our intended audience is the data center and they're fully went through their tech refresh and aren't even having this system in their data centers anymore, what's the point in us supporting it if, no one's going to be using it? Obviously, that's kind of, from their perspective, they're thinking, the data center people, obviously people are still going to be using it from, the consumer aspect, people buying these up for the heck of it and using it that way. But from their perspective, their target audience would no longer be using it. So from their perspective, what's the point in supporting it? So that's the reason why the Xserve, why Apple stopped supporting it, both from the hardware and the software perspective. But now I want to take a fun little twist of, should you buy one? Should you buy a Xserve in 2022? So Apple obviously doesn't sell them anymore, but you can still find them on eBay. Now, personally, I would definitely not recommend the 1.1 or a PowerPC Xserve, mainly because the incompatibility with the latest macOS. But when I was looking on eBay for pricing on Xserves, for whatever reason, I don't know why, there were so many like whatever it's called, PowerPC G5, like Xserves going for well over $1,000, which I have no idea why, unless people are like, it's a PowerPC one, it's super old, I want. Like, that's the only thing I can think of, because there's like zero use for that thing today. Now, as far as the 1,1's concerned, again, I don't recommend it because it's a 32-bit CPU, so you can't run anything past macOS Lion. Now, as for the 2,1 and 3,1's, personally, I also don't recommend it, unless you're just after the novelty factor and you think it's cool, which in that case, I 100% agree with you. I have one in my rack, and it looks very cool. So if you're going for that perspective, then sure. But the thing that I noticed was these 2,1 and 3,1 Xserves, $200 was pretty much the floor of the pricing for these things. So you have to think you're paying $200 for a 14-year-old machine. And also, what I have not mentioned is generally that $200, you're going to be missing something. Well, actually, you're definitely going to be missing something. The thing you'll most likely be missing is drive sleds, either all of them or some of them. Probably won't have any hard drives with it. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. RAM, maybe you do, maybe you don't. Or a combination of all three of those. You might have some, might not have any. It's really, a shot in the dark of, what you'll get. But the one thing that you definitely won't get for $200 is a set of rails included. Now, maybe you don't care about mounting it on rails. Maybe you want to get some, just kind of like a rack shelf or something that you can just plop it on. And yeah, sure, you could do that. Although personally, I don't think it looks as good as having it on its own thing of rails. But, that's just me. So personally, for me, when I bought mine, I bought it back in 2021 for $230 shipped. And that came with the dual Xeon E5462s, which was the 2.8 quad-core Xeon at the time. So it was like the middle of the road spec. It wasn't the top of the line spec, but the top of the line, I think, was only clocked at 3 gigahertz. So with how old these CPUs are, you're really not going to notice that performance at all. It came with 4 drive sleds instead of the 3, so I got an extra one, which is pretty cool. Came with a terabyte hard drive, 10 gigs of RAM, and the rail kit. So it was a complete machine with everything for $230 shipped. Now for $230, you'll probably be missing things and won't get a rail kit. So, yeah, big oof. And also, but since then, I have made upgrades to it. I've added more storage to it. I added extra RAM to it. And I upgraded the GPU in it just so I could have metal support for running modern versions of macOS. And I also bought an extra power supply for it because if you're going to have a rack-mounted server, why not have redundant power supplies? But all in all, I think if I did want to sell it, which I don't, I could probably easily get at least double, if not a lot more. And the reason I say that is because while I was searching Xserves, I found a listing for essentially the same spec as mine, minus the storage and the GPU, with the rails, and it was going for $425. Oof. For me, if I wanted to sell it, that's pretty good. But from a consumer perspective, yikes. Especially so if we look at a standalone rail kit, they're generally asking over $100. I think $125 was around what I saw for it. Now, obviously, like I said, you could get a rack shelf or one of those things that mounts as quote-unquote rails, but it's just kind of like a partial shelf that you could slide the server on and off. Obviously, it's not as elegant of a solution, but if you want something cheap, it could get the job done. But what I want to do is kind of explain to you why this isn't a good idea of why you shouldn't spend that kind of money on an Xserve, unless, like I mentioned, unless you're solely in it for the novelty and the looks of it because it looks cool, and aren't like thinking of in your mind that this Xserve is going to be a staple powerhouse of your home lab. Because if that's what you're thinking, I'm about to absolutely destroy all your hopes and dreams right now. So if we take that Xserve, that complete Xserve build for $425, let's look at some things that you could get instead of that. So recently, I actually made a 1U server build, and it has two dual Xeon E5 2650 V2s, which are Ivy Bridge chips, I believe. So many generations newer than what is in the Xserve. It has 128 gigs of RAM, which is also, I should note, is DDR3 RAM, not DDR2, so it's better, faster, and newer. It has an SSD boot drive, 2 terabytes of storage, and Rails, all for $300. So $125 less. And if we look at the performance numbers from CPUbenchmark.net, the 8 cores and 16 cores and 32 threads of my dual 2650 V2s is going up against a total of 8 cores and 8 threads of the Xserve. And it's just an absolute bloodbath. The dual 2650s score 17,491, and the Xserve Xeon score a anemic 4,504. Yeah. Ouch. So for a recap, that's $125 less, and you get a system that can run circles around the Xserve, take a nap, and be back to dinner before the Xserve even gets a quarter of the way off the start line. So say you don't want to buy all those components and put everything together yourself. This Xserve is obviously a complete set, and you just want to buy a complete set. All right, fair, fine. So in this case, say you buy a loaded PowerEdge R620 with dual Xeon 2670s, 64 gigs of RAM, 4 600 gigabyte SAS drives, and Rails for $435. Yeah, you're spending an extra $10, but you're also getting double the RAM, which is also newer and faster. You're getting more storage. And compared to the Xserve's 4,504 CPU score, you're getting 15,751 with the 2670s. So again, you're absolutely destroying the Xserve in every objective measure, and you're paying $10 more. But alternatively, you can go even cheaper. You can get an R620 with 32 gigs of RAM, 2 1 terabyte hard drives, and dual 2650s, not the V2 version, and that'll cost you $267 and then $75 for the Rails. So all in, you're just under $350. And again, you still wipe the floor with the Xserve scoring around 13,000 compared to the Xserve's 4,504. So, yeah, if you're looking at the Xserve as some kind of compute powerhouse, if your dreams weren't completely destroyed there, I don't know what fantasy world you're living in, but I would like to visit it, so please let me know so I can come visit it. Now, obviously, the Xserve, as I mentioned, is a loud, roaring beast. Which, as I mentioned in the previous episode, I was going to try to work on a way to quiet those fans. I have done a little bit of looking into it. So far, nothing's worked so far. So I'll have to do a lot more digging with the no documentation that exists. So that'll be fun. But because it's so loud, say you want something, and say you don't even have a rack, so there's not much point in having a rack-mounted server if you don't have a rack for it, so you go with a comparably priced workstation. So you get a HP Z440 or a comparable machine like a Dell Precision or Lenovo ThinkStation from the same gen. Now, I'm actually not sure if this version of the HP Z40 was a good deal or not compared to other HP Z440s or even Dell Precisions or Lenovo ThinkStations of the same generation. But for the sake of this sole comparison with the Xserve, you can get an HP Z440 with an E5 2698 V3, which has 16 cores and 32 threads, 32 gigs of DDR4 RAM. So unlike those R620 Dell servers, this has DDR4 RAM, so it's even newer than that RAM, which was already newer than the DDR2 RAM of that Xserve, so way big step up. It has 128 gigabyte SSD boot drive, and then a terabyte of additional storage with a Quadro K4000 thrown in there for good measure. So because it's not a rack-mounted server, it's obviously going to be a heck of a lot quieter. So the Xserve, again, scoring that 4,504 compared to 18,489 clocked in by the 2698 V3. So absolutely destroys the Xserve again. Not even close. And as I think I actually forgot to mention this. This HP workstation, by the way, was $400, so $25 cheaper, and you're getting, performance that's not even close. Now, as far as the Quadro K4000, as far as GPUs go, it's definitely nothing to write home about. It's a 10-year-old card, but when you compare it to the ATI Radeon X 1300 that's in the 2.1 Xserve, or the GT 120 that's in the 3.1 Xserve, the K4000 basically looks like a Greek god compared to those GPUs, and even compared to the GPU that I have in my Xserve that I upgraded with, which is the GT 640, it still essentially wipes the floor with it. So the K4000 scores 2700. The Radeon X1300 scores 58. I'm not kidding. It actually scores 58. The GT120 destroys that Radeon with a score of 175, which again is pretty abysmal compared to the 2700 the K4000 scores. And then the GT640 that's in my Xserve scores just under 1200. So again, the K4000, obviously compared to these GPUs, looks pretty good. It's, if you compare it to anything, remotely decent and kind of semi-modern, it gets absolutely destroyed. And obviously, and this was according to videocardbenchmark.net if you care. So if it all comes down to it, if the reason you're looking for an Xserve is to be a server or even a server that runs macOS, literally just buy a 2012 i7 Mac Mini. Sure, you're going to be limited to 16 gigs of RAM, but also keep in mind this is DDR3 RAM, and it's going to be most likely 1600 megahertz, which is a lot faster, a lot better than the DDR2 or even really slow DDR3 that would be in a 3.1 Xserve. And when you compare the performance from these quad-core i7s that's in the 2012 Mac Minis compared to the Xeons that are in the Xserve, the i7 actually beats it out by, I forget I didn't write down the exact numbers, but from what I recall, it's like if you get the lower clocked, I believe is the 2.3 gigahertz i7, you'll beat the Xserves by about, I think it's like 600 points. And then if you get the higher clocked 2.6 gigahertz one, you'll beat it by like just over 1,000 points, which those are quad-core hyper-threaded processors, so they have 4 cores and 8 threads. So a thread-to-thread comparison, it's 8 and 8. And also, not to mention, if you get a Mac Mini, it's going to be way quieter, way smaller, and way cheaper, and consume way less power than one of those Xserves. So there's really no losing there. And the other thing with these Mac Minis is you can actually put multiple hard drives in them, so you can have 2 drives in them, which is pretty nice. So you can pretty much do what you want with that. So yeah, if you want a server, I mean, the only limitation of the Mac Mini is the fact that it only has 16 gigs of RAM. But at the same time, that RAM is also newer and faster. So I'm not sure how much of a downside it is. Plus, the Mac Mini i7 you can get for like, I don't remember the exact prices, like somewhere between, I think, like $120, $150. So you're looking at like 2 to 3 Mac Minis for one equipped Xserve. So at that point, you probably have more RAM, especially if we're comparing it to that one for $425 that had 32 gigs of RAM. You got more RAM in your 3 Mac Minis and way more compute power and more storage too. Your power bill is going to be less. It's going to be a lot quieter in your house. And yeah, so the TLDR, or I guess since this is a podcast, the TLDL, too long didn't listen, don't buy an Xserve. If you think the Xserve is going to be a staple in your home lab and some kind of compute beast or something, because the cost to performance is just not there at all. But if you just want one because you think they look cool, because by the way, they definitely do. It looks amazing racked up in a rack in a home lab. So if you just want it, for the novelty and the aesthetics of it, then heck, 100% knock yourself out, go for it. But yeah, I think that we went long on this one. I hope you enjoyed it. I definitely enjoyed sitting down and talking about the Xserve, talking about it with you guys. And if you enjoyed this episode, I ask that you leave a rating and review and subscribe to the Dark Assassins podcast if you haven't done so already. And also be sure to share with a friend or family member who would be interested in hearing, what happened to the Xserve, especially if they've never heard of the Xserve before. Kind of give them a nice history lesson. And if you have any questions about this episode, the inspiration for this episode came from a question from a viewer like you. If you have a question about this episode or a topic in general that you want me to talk about, shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. Link in the show notes below that you can click on. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bull nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.